Hi there, welcome to my presentation. This is just a quick 15-minute recap of the session I delivered to the England Handball guys at their national conference in 2014. My name's Dave Piggott. I'm a senior lecturer in sports coaching at Leeds Metropolitan University, and the session was all about what makes an enjoyable coaching session. Now, the session lasted an hour in reality, so I'm just going to kind of skip over some of the slides, given the heads of the content that I talked about. So in terms of the workshop, I wanted there to be two basic outcomes. The first one being the main one, that the guys should leave with 3 practical strategies that they could prioritise to increase enjoyment, but also probably just as important to be able to explain why those strategies were going to lead to increased enjoyment. So to understand what kinds of strategies and techniques in terms of their teaching and pedagogy are going to lead to enjoyment and why. In terms of why we focused on enjoyment for the workshop, basically speaking, the coaches who'd replied to a request for information had told us that these were the kinds of problems they were having. These are red at the bottom, so things like keeping people interested and managing large groups, engaging kids, keeping people involved, and these are all things that I could relate to enjoyment. And it's also something that coaches can control, and it's something that, as a minority sport in terms of handball, you can't really afford to lose people. So if somebody comes along to a session and doesn't really enjoy themselves and doesn't come back, when you don't have that many participants in the sport anyway, it's not something you can afford to struggle with as a coach. So really important for minority sports. Just as a bit of context for some of the stuff that comes up, I talked to the guys about the model that we use here at Leeds Metropolitan, that we use to structure our degree programmes. So this is emerged from work done by my colleagues Bob Muir and Andy Abraham, Gareth Morgan, and they use this sort of three-pillar approach to understanding coaching. That really coaching's a process. So at the heart of the process is plan, do, review. But in planning and doing and reviewing their coaching, coaches draw on 3 main domains of knowledge. So they need to know about the who, so the performers and their stage of development. They need to know about the what, so that's the sport and the tactical, technical demands of the sport. And then finally they need to know about the how, so how are they going to create an optimal learning environment, so it's knowledge of learning and teaching strategies. Now this is where I focus my presentation, because this is the one aspect that is in control of coach. So a coach can't change the demands of the sport or the nature of their performers, but what they can do is they can affect how they deliver, and obviously how you deliver changes dependent on the performer and the sport. And I went further and basically, again following my colleague Bob Muir's work, determined that this how stuff can be split up into 2 further categories. So our pedagogy, our delivery, can be split into how we behave and also how we structure our practices or the kinds of activities we deliver. So what I was then going to suggest was that these 2 things, the activities or the practice structure and the behaviours that we use, are the 2 things that we can really control, and the 2 things we can manipulate in order to create greater enjoyment. So we just did a think, pair, share activity and tried to think about what kinds of activities we find enjoyable and what kind of activities, what kind of coach behaviours lead to enjoyment. We got those up on the board. I then kind of pulled that together using this model from Weiss and Amoros, which summarises a little bit some of the research that's been done on sport enjoyment. So if you think about enjoyment in the middle, and there are causes of enjoyment, so these are the things at the top, and then there are consequences of enjoyment, which are the things at the bottom. So the causes we can put into 3 broad categories, they being achievement, and I only concentrated on things that I've highlighted in red here. So in achievement, we're talking about things like mastering skills and techniques, and increasing the perceived competence in a particular sport. There's a social category, so children often talk about friendships and getting recognition from peers and adults, and they find those things enjoyable about sport. And then they also talk about what we might call sort of intrinsic factors like excitement and energy and the joy of movement and the sensation of movement, and also flow, that sort of idea of being in the zone and sort of optimal psychological functioning. So when you talk to people about what causes enjoyment, these are the kinds of things that we get. And in terms of consequences, obviously, if you enjoy sport, you're likely to come back over and over again. So it develop increased frequency, intensity, and time of behaviour in the sport, and also which then in turn leads to greater sport commitment, developing a sporting identity, and presumably lifelong participation. So this was the basic model that we looked at, and I said that I would then concentrate on these causes of enjoyment and talk about how as coaches we can manipulate those things. So I started off with this slide on flow, and flow is a concept that's been kicking around in the psychological literature for probably about 30 or 40 years now, and it's basically this idea that that flow is this sort of optimal psychological state that we can get into where everything feels easy and natural and automatic, and you don't have to think too hard, and time seems to stand still or speed up, and it's inherently enjoyable, this experience, and we're all familiar with it. We've all had that experience, and we know a little bit about what brings that experience about, and it's really when you get a match between a perceived challenge and a perceived skill level. So this diagram here shows that if we have a low perceived challenge and a low perceived skill level, we'll get to flow, or a high perceived challenge and a high perceived skill, we'll get into flow as well. Whereas if the challenge is high but the skill is low, we get worry or anxiety, or conversely, if we get high perceived skill with a low perceived challenge, we get boredom. So our job as a coach is really to make sure that we try and keep our athletes in this flow zone for as long as we can, and we can do things to manipulate that. So we can use verbal prompts like, it's not as easy as you think, or it's could you do that with more quality or greater consistency, if you're trying to get somebody who's got a high perceived skill level to reduce that. Or somebody who's anxious, you can say, look, this isn't as hard as you think, or I think you're good enough to do it. We can raise their perceived level of skill. So part of this is to do with how we interact with our athletes. It's the coach behaviour stuff. We can also do things in terms of differentiation. So I talked to the guys about grouping, and this whole grey section here shows that we could, for example, decide to take a session, a mixed session, and group people, create two separate groups within the session based on similar ability. Now we could do that through self-selection, so we could have a task, an initial warm-up task, as shown in the diagram there, where everybody starts on the same activity. We ask everybody, did you find that easy, did you find that hard, and then they self-select a group based on that question. And then based on them being in a sort of medium group or a high group, for example, a medium group, this green arrow could take a very different route through the session than the high group. So you would have then a series of activities, each of which had different progressions, and people could start off at different levels of progression within the same activity. So that's one way of making sure that we try and achieve flow, because then we get athletes operating at an appropriate level of challenge. I also talked about this important different distinction between winning and losing and success, and I think one of the things that, and it's made well in this point by Smith and Small here, as a coach, it's important that we define and reward success. So success isn't the same as winning. We can determine and say, regardless of winning or losing, I can say that giving maximum effort, or improving skill execution or skill mastery, or following a team strategy that we've established, this is what is successful, and I can reward that as a coach. And it's important. That's important because those things are all under the control of the players, whereas winning and losing is often not in the control of the players. So it's an important distinction to make, and it's important because it affects how we give feedback. So we talked about feedback as well, and how we can use feedback to influence perceived competence or perceived skill. And I suggested to the guys here that whenever we give feedback as a general rule, we should follow this 4Ps process, which is the feedback should be personal, positive, purposeful, and proportionate. So an example might be personal. We use the person's name, so they know it's directed at them. We praise behaviour or effort or improvement or something. We explain what was good, so there's some purpose to the feedback, and then it needs to be proportionate, so it actually meets the athlete's perception of their performance as well. So we're not praising poor performance when the athlete knows that it was bad, so the feedback will be disingenuous. So an example here is, I've got a kid who's doing a basketball shooting drill, saying, I say, George, and I wait for him to acknowledge that. Great shot, so that's the positive bit. And then the purposeful bit is you really got your feet under the ball there, which is something that I might want to try to reinforce. It's a technical point. And then also praise the effort. So great effort when fatigued. So giving that type of feedback instead of just saying, yeah, great, well done, is 10 times more effective than in terms of improving somebody's perceived competence and skill. But of course you do need to give constructive feedback. So we talked about the feedback sandwich, and if you're going to give something constructive feedback, so in the middle here, I'd like to see your feet pointing at the hoop more consistently. If I just said that on its own, it would have a different effect than if I said, hey, your footwork's improving, so a positive point. I'd like to see your feet pointing at the hoop consistently, and then try to maintain that high effort. So we're sandwiching a bit of constructive feedback in between two bits of positive feedback, which is generally easy to digest from the performer's point of view. We then went on to talk about this notion of movement sensations and a different aspect of enjoyment, and this is something children often talk about in research. Is they really enjoy expressing themselves. They like freedom to do what they want to do and to move and to to feel, just enjoy the movement. And this is captured by this German word Funktionslust, which is really the lust for function, the lust for movement. And I think about my sport, basketball, and what kids really enjoy, and they love doing, they love making blocks and running on the fast break and making flashy passes and circus shots and buzzer beaters and ankle breakers. And this video here was basically designed to illustrate that. And then I asked the coaches to translate that and say, well, what do kids love about handball? And the implication is, of course, that we need to really think about that. Like, what is it about our sports that children really like? And can we do more of it in our sessions? So it's an activity or practice structure point here we're making, is that how much of this do we actually do, and how much freedom and self-expression do we allow on behalf of our players? And I think often the answer is not a lot, and something we can definitely do more of. We then finished off with a video looking at some handball practices and trying to rate the enjoyability of the fun factor of these practices based on the information we'd looked at before. And then I finished off with this task of prioritising practical strategies, so getting the guys to look at a worksheet of practical strategies and then figuring out 3 that they could employ in their own coaching straight away. And if I just bring that up a second, these are the strategies here. So in each case I had the strategy, so something practical they could do, and then how would that link to enjoyment or one of these factors that affects enjoyment. So yeah, have a look through the strategies and makes you understand why these strategies have an effect on enjoyment, and see how you get on. But don't try to do too much at once. Take one thing at a time and see how that goes.